First of all, thank you both, and Benjamin, for really informative talks and for sharing so much about your respective practices. And thanks to Bar Vulcan for some refreshment before we started, and looking forward to some more soon. I guess one of the things that unifies the two speakers, aside from the fact that they're both participating in the Frieze Fair this year, is that they're both collectives. So it's slightly unbalanced because Benjamin's representing his enormous collective as an individual.
I may be joining in some minutes, we'll see.
Yeah, and then
they might appear.
Yeah, they might.
we have
selling all the books now.
We have all of AIR here, which is, we're very lucky. So, yeah, I think that one of the things that interests me really, there's lots of detailed things that interest me about both the talks, but I'm going to start thinking a little bit about collectives. So I'm sort of interested in opening the discussion up a little bit with all of you guys here and with the people up on the stage. Thinking something about how collectives make decisions collectively. It's pretty interesting. And how collectives sustain themselves over time. Your collective is pretty new, so you haven't had to face that yet, but your collective has been going since 2007, and so we've been treated to a lot of archive material, and we're very lucky in this day and age to have technology so that we can produce archives without it costing an enormous amount, and your archive is really informative and really interesting, and lots of people's names who I've sort of worked with appeared on it. It's very nice. So yeah, could we maybe start off about thinking a little bit about collective working? That would be really nice. I kind of already know the answer, but nobody else does here, I think. So I'm just going to ask Air to start off with, to talk a little bit about how you all met and how you found that the collective was a kind of a good way to work. And Benjamin, if you'd like to interject, and anyone from the floor who'd like to contribute as well, that would be great. Thank you.
The story of how we met is kind of quite rather banal, because we met we were all studying at the Architecture Association in London, in different capacities. And
yeah, I don't think that's banal. I think it's really sort of super relevant, how people come
well, we
together.
Are in the school in a way.
It's to do with space. Like Benjamin mentioned that a space was really significant, and physical space still has real relevance. So,
yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
No, for a while we had been saying that we had met on Tinder. But then we dropped that storyline because we got tired of it pretty quickly. No, we met at the Architecture Association, and we were all like separately connected and did like projects or things together separately. And then we came together we wanted to do something at this. At the Architectural Biennale in 2014. Mm-hmm. We were interested in the brief that was put forth by the curator, Rem Koolhaas, and we wanted to do something that was independent, like, kind of self-generated.
It was also kind of pragmatic because we didn't have anywhere to stay, and we kind of wanted to go there we wanted to be there, so we kind of were like, let's just rent some apartments in Airbnb, and at the same time like do a project inside it, and also like it allowed us to actually have the conversation we wanted to have, also by the means of us being sustainable by being able to be there, basically.
Mm-hmm. So it didn't start in a way. Our us working together did not start as a collective. Mm-hmm. It started as a one-off project in which we came together, and it was. We didn't have an idea to like do something afterwards necessarily. But then, as we worked on it, and especially after that exhibition, we realized that actually there was something more that we wanted to do with this kind of.
It was kind of magical, just the four perspectives, kind of sitting in a table all together in a very nice way, all coming from different, let's say, worries or concerns, or also like different points of views, and suddenly coming together with one, let's say, focus. Mm-hmm. And it just felt really natural, and we then decided to continue doing it because
and also doing a collective, I think for me is also creating almost like another entity, that it's not your individual voice, but it's almost like a character that like exists beyond the individuals. So that
yes, yeah.
I would say that's been also something very important for Castillo Corrales, which is like, for example, like we, from the first group, I was not part of the very, very first group, and the way we kind of really worked together on text, the way we used really easily is this kind of like fake identity of cashier callers as something that would allow anybody to reply to the same email and to write together text in English, which was also something really fun to do in terms of using a language which is not ours at first, and build this kind of, as you could see in the website, we also have this kind of narrative in, like when you are in the archive, actually most of the time the shows are not named after the name of the show, but after another kind of sentence that kind of says something about it in a weird way afterwards. And we would be like really keen on building little by little this kind of identity through this kind of collective writing. Well, of course, if you know individually the different people, you kind of sometimes guess that, oh, the one or the other maybe had like more of a take on one text. But it was really also this kind of like organic way of like bringing people together, or like also bringing people from the audience. I mean, there was, for example, how working with this kind of publishing brought people like graphic designer to work with us first as some kind of, I mean, helping and like finally keeping, being part of the collective and working on some project, and sometimes being responsible for some things but on their own, would be also this kind of like kind of organic flow of people. Sometimes people would also like just participate for 1 year and like leave and stuff like that. We're at the moment when like this kind of like fluid also way of working is becoming more difficult, because of course it gives like it takes lots of energy, and other indeed like personal consideration also come into like the decision on how much you can take part in one thing or the other. But I would really say that this question of the building the identities, it's at the same time super fun, and it allows you to do things that you would never do before.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's quite interesting reflecting while you're speaking about where collective writing exists in other situations. So I don't think there are so many texts that get published as individual books that are collectively generated. But of course, in like HBO, in all those super successful TV series, they're written by great big teams, as are the very strong American cartoons. And so it's kind of quite interesting. It's a kind of unexplored territory, really. I mean, it has great value in terms of production of television, for sure, but it's not so big, is it? But within architectural practice, obviously, teams are super important. You know, all the big name architects whose companies, you know, they're all on this one single solo identity, but they're all backed up, as we know, by these incredibly hardworking CAD jockeys and all the rest of them. Yeah. It's
not as schizophrenic though as you would have it in a writing collective, let's say, because I feel like when you're writing, the voices start coming more out. But like I feel in like an architectural practice, you don't have that. Let's say schizophrenia that makes it more interesting. Going back to TV, for example, like a TV show, that's why it's interesting watching it, because the character has so many layers to it, because there's so many people adding to it.
Yes, yeah.
And I feel like that's there's that distinction. Might be interesting. I don't know.
And you worked a bit with Hobby Pop, I think, who are a kind of collective painting outfit, which is really interesting, because painting is probably the ultimate solo created kind of object.
Yeah, with Hobby Pop Museum, I guess one interesting thing is that for a long time it was also really related to the fact that they were also sharing a studio and have this kind of like situation when like suddenly paintings could be like faking a tennis match, or like making this kind of like weird decor, or like bringing also this kind of like situation. It really would be like this kind of thing that you don't also look at on a frame, or something that is like an environment conducive to parties and other kind also of elements. And at the same time, something that was when we worked with Hobby Pop in that show that I quickly showed some picture of, called The Group. One of the aspects we were interested in like showing was also how these groups would like represent themselves. Sometime in like a weird situation, like this band, The Shattering, there's like some kind of like video in which they're fake an interview, pretty violent interview, the ones between the other. And Hobby Pop has been also like really great in like taking photos of themselves and like making this kind of like a mise en scène of the group in like a luxurious environment when they do nothing, which has been on certain occasion indeed, I guess, like related to the fact that they would be invited for residency in like places where like they would just like feel like totally like ill at ease, or like so like playing also with this group thing would be funny. Would be a good way also to. But as far as Castillo is concerned, we've been very bad with like collective photos, for example.
We're also very bad at that. There's always one.
You're young.
Yeah. But we're in the boy band phase of the project as well.
Yeah, I think that's also like, I think in our case, I think it's our, like us working together is also more, it's a less loose format. It's like, because it being four and it's always four, it's kind of, I mean, we're working out like this model in a way, but I think so far it's been, like every project has to have the contribution of each one of us, even though of course then it's attributed to our collective entity, but I think it has been quite structured. It's not so loose.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
Yeah, let's say like for Castillo, the loose dimension would be that at some point it would also be this kind of situation where like we would share responsibilities, or like I guess pretty early on when I first, like as I showed that the bookstore, for example, was first conceived as like, instead of doing a show, we transformed the space in the bookstore. And just after that time, for example, we were doing a project in another institution in Paris when we brought the bookstore, and there was a show by this other gallery in the space, and then just Oscar Toison like curated a show so we could also like do this kind of like shared responsibilities on project, and like kind of also of like find this kind of moment when it's more like all together, but still kind of consider that well, as soon as something is done by Castillo Corrales, it's done by like everybody. There's this kind of for me, like on several occasions, project I was not part of, project I was not totally involved in, would be also things that I would like take my kind of like part of in a second or third time, showing the space to different people and talking about it, or like thinking about it on my own, and like so then having this kind of like a kind of flow of like a discussion and like work together. Recently, like what I was showing at the beginning, that how the website is split at the moment, because we've been working with this other institution in Portland. Well, Yale Union, for example, is at the same time. It's a space that has been created by like artists and people who are also coming from the music world mostly, and they have like a huge space. It's really incredible that such an institution can be born and like develop out of any like public mission or public support at the moment. I mean, they have like small public support, but like the origin of it's really like this kind of like this kind of like collective will of a small group of people. And one way of working with, like it was also at some point really difficult to work together, because each structure has like really like specific and like almost untold way of working that makes it like a bit, even if we're friends, at some point it's impossible to understand how the others are working. So a good way to put it was just to say that at some point, let's say, who needs vacation? So they send some of the people for like 3 months to live in our space so that they can take some time off. That's also a good way to work together.
Yeah, that sounds really good, yeah. I just also wanted to ask you a little bit more about the kind of, sort of changing the subject a little bit completely, but the spatial arrangement in Frieze. So you talked about that a bit, and it was very interesting. I liked how you said it was this distillation of the generic bedroom, 12 metre square, and with the colour scheme and the cornicing and the floorboardy, whatever you call it, the thing around the trim around the edge, the skirting. Thank you.
It took us a long time to choose, actually.
Yeah, it's very. It looks like this kind of super generic distillation of every one of these rooms that's being built in the last sort of 15 years around Europe and actually further out, all over the globe. So yeah, I'm just really interested. And then I went to see your show as well in Brookmuse, so I saw this same device with this room after room. So it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more about that.
Well, I think in terms of like the distillating this kind of generic aesthetic, it's almost like we've been interested in kind of doing or like inquire in a sort of like anthropology of taste that kind of comes out of looking at websites like Airbnb, in which basically have become an unprecedented repository and a section through a world of interiors, so to speak. So it's a very unprecedented access to the interior space of millions of people, which is kind of there's obviously millions of images on the website, and it's really the first time in history that we have this access to this interior. So in a way, like just browsing, which is we do like in a way periodically we just browse in a way endlessly through the website to kind of have start gathering, let's say, the memes or like the repeating elements in this kind of interiors. And that, I think that interjects also with other kinds of websites or online platforms where people share their homes, which are not Airbnb, because obviously the Airbnb has its own aesthetic, which is constructed by the photography, that is, carried on by the company. But there is also web, like all kinds of Facebook groups or like, social media groups where people share, or Craigslist, where like the aesthetic that emerges from that is completely different. So in a way, like after doing all this research in these different platforms, we wanted to maybe it's a bit naive to think that you could distill an essence from it, which is, we didn't really want to distill an essence, but we wanted to, some things emerged in a way, like some patterns emerged. And in terms of, then the other side of the question was the spatial device of like the repetition and the illusion.
And you were talking before about these palaces and the design, the sort of access to.
But this is because I think we've been we basically, we are the four of us are trained in architecture school. So in a way, even though we have very deliberately defined ourselves as an art collective, we still use architecture as the medium that we let's say employ in our work. So in a way, and we also try to also undo our, let's say, architectural education in a way by using also the tools of decoration rather than space making. So for example, the reason why we have been using this kind of spatial device of like repetition is because it comes from the tradition of trompe-l'oeil, which is basically like constructing architectural space out of a flat surface, which is in a way we saw a parallel between that phenomenon, like that technique, and the reality of the home as it is displayed as a commodity online. So in a way, like that was kind of an intuition that we had, and we're kind of still working with that device because we find it productive to kind of as a point of entry into a set of other ideas. So in Freeze, also like there was also another set of constraints, which was the fact that like the space was built within the temporary infrastructure of the fair, which is basically an absolutely outrageous and insane endeavor, which in which every year they construct these giant tents in Regent's Park, just a meter above the ground, and we wanted to construct a space that felt quite solid within that space. And also we maybe in an opposite way as you, we wanted to have as much space as possible. So actually we tried to find like a space within the fair that allowed like an unused space that allowed us to kind of maximize.
Because Freeze real estate is like the most expensive, like it's so expensive to get any square meters out of the fair, and because we're part of the non-for-profit, let's say, aspect of the fair.
I did want to ask you actually how much you could work with Nicola on where exactly within the fair you were, and
we kind of since the very beginning we kind of located that there was a gap in between how they built the tents because there's 4 of them.
Yes.
So there's always this gap in the middle when 2 connect, and that gap is usually just never used. And we asked for the galleries to be pushed a little bit forward so we could have a little bit more space. And it's crazy though because like they were like, you're never gonna get this much space. You can never do this like project. And then suddenly we found this gap, and initially it just like clicked.
Yeah.
And it just happened basically.
Yeah.
I don't know how it was for you to like demand for this space, or was it ever a problem?
No, I think that there was first a strange like proposition to use some kind of like how you say that. It's kind of like a stage theater thing that they wanted to bring to the fair. Which was that felt like, well, if we would have used it, it really would have felt like making like clowny things every day with a little thing. So we didn't really demand for a specific kind of space. There was like, for us, like the important dimension was like to agree on this kind of production situation for the book. Then it was like agreed that there we would have like a physical like a presence, but indeed it came as a surprise that indeed given like the economy of a square meter in such a situation that we would have like a really real like such a space. It's actually like, yeah, it's bigger than the first space we had in Paris. It's as big as a gallery space that we have, and like I didn't show pictures, but like we have like the bookstore is only like one part of the space we have now. So it's also like that's not really like we didn't come with a project of an installation as such. So we ended up doing also something with this kind of trompe-l'œil idea, being inspired actually by the fact that we were at the very end of the fair. Like it's really like the last corner kind of, and we thought that it could be interesting to kind of create this kind of like hole or like kind of strange gap in this corner. So there was one first idea to indeed like also change with the walls or something like this. It ended up being a bit too expensive to produce. So we opted then to this kind of like a fake space that got also like a bit more weirder, because one of the other projects they commissioned to an artist, Thea Georgiadze, she made some kind of rocking chairs and plants on wheels, and we fostered some of them. So we have those kind of like weird situation. I mean, well, we ended up being like kind of stuck in a normal booth situation, like which is which is okay.
I just wanted, before we completely open it up to questions, I wanted to just mention on sublets, because that was also quite interesting. And you were talking about sublets in, you were talking about that in the context of working in Peckham in the car park. And I was just reminded of this very interesting research project that was conducted by London School of Economics by a woman called Susan Hall. I don't know if you know that study. It's really interesting, and it's all around sublets on a high street, isn't it? And how a shop unit is rented by one kind of major, that the one person takes on the lease and then sublets to many other kinds of businesses, like the phone shop and the hairdressing shop and the Western Union area and all of these kinds of things. And the most amazing fact that came out of that project was that the people who are renting the phone shops are effectively paying the same rent as they would pay in Knightsbridge, which is incredible. So the economies are really fascinating to kind of understand. So it would be really nice maybe to just speak a little bit more about sublets, and if you have any more plans in that direction, or is it too early to say?
Well, I mean the sublet, as you mentioned, I mean it's a phenomenon that we've been looking at, because for sure it impacts and it subverts the economy of rent in a city, and platforms like online home sharing platforms have completely, in a way, systematized and optimized that unruly, let's say, landscape of subletting.
I guess the Airbnb is also another version of the sublet, isn't it?
Exactly. So I think, I mean, specifically in Peckham, or in areas that are like being gentrified, I think that phenomenon, like, it's almost quite violent, because it's a very invisible and under the radar and untraceable karstic river that kind of disrupts the rent economy of the city, especially in a city like London, where, like, of course, we all know that the rent market is like an insane jungle. I mean, the phenomenon of subletting is this kind of like shadow practice. Whether it's like when it's legal or not legal, it's kind of interesting in the relations also that it establishes. I mean, especially like on online platforms when there is also, it's almost like also an anthropological phenomenon in which like the relations that are built when you sublet are also, I think, interesting.
Yeah, they go beyond the kind of landlord-tenant relationship. You always have this inherent kind of relationship with the identity of the person that you're doing it with, because there's always this kind of exchange and trust behind it, because there's no real contract behind it, let's say. So we're interested in that aspect of property also being able to be traded not only through let's say a contract or a financial benefit, but also more like a human, let's say, connection, transaction. So then I think that's why we also like to open up our projects up, because in some ways it's like we see them as platforms also for other conversations to start happening around it, and we don't want it to be just I mean, I think it comes from being a collective that we don't want it to be just insular conversation that just happens amongst the four of us, but it's also something that is open for people to also interpret and open up different, let's say, ways of interacting with it. Yeah, disrupted, actually. I think that's the most interesting thing, is like you also ultimately let go of that control that you have over a piece, let's say. And do something, it's
which
like,
is the same as subletting a house.
A house. You're like, that fear of like letting go of like your intimate space or your like actual like your possession is something that I think people need to be more like accustomed to do. So also like I feel like it like brings it to a different level somehow.
Yeah.
We have something to say.
So I wonder if we have any questions from the audience. Yeah, at the back, thank you.
I was wondering what the panel sees the difference between a collective and a co-op or something else, or any other kind of, because a collective can in the end operate much the same way as an individual does, particularly I guess in the context of freeze.
I think for us, I think we do operate. It's a collective that does. You can say that it operates almost as an individual. It's definitely not a co-op. Like it definitely ends up having an individual voice as much as we try to bring other voices in. It definitely has that. Maybe that limit, but at the end of the day, I mean, this is a format that we are also exploring and also trying to experiment with. So I think so far, I think you are, you're right pointing out the fact that as a collective very much can have, can be perceived as an individual with an individual voice.
Though I think that the point is that the collective structure is like still a challenge to like the question of like, I don't know exactly what kind of notion you put behind the notion of the individual in such a circumstances. Indeed, we are not a cooperative in terms that we would act within a specific kind of organization of different agents or actors seeking for the same kind of having same kind of like a work that needs to be put together to get more power. Indeed, what we did collectively, what we do together at Castillo Corrales, it's things that we can't do individually. Nobody at Castillo can do individually what's happening with Castillo Corrales. It's not possible. That's a first element that for me is very important. And the second one is that it's also like a continuous challenge on identity, authorship, and authority. It's like for me, like always, like always, I don't know. That's also one of my interests with the book. There's this famous like idea that authors don't write books. Books are written by their authors. It's because like you can say at some point that of this pilot book that the author entity of Marcel Proust exists. Otherwise, there's no author like as such. That's also like this kind of construction that for me, like the collective is important yeah, there's a relevance for me in terms of when indeed you go to, I don't know if it's what you mean, but when you go to an art fair, indeed, like all artists are represented as like geniuses and individuals that would have been doing everything by their own all of their lives, which is of course most of the time not true at all. For me, like the collective is still one of these like conscious constructions that allows to kind of challenge this too easy way to consider what is like creativity and I don't know, artistic activity today.
I guess that part of the reason I was asking this question, yeah, I agree. It's a good way of kind of challenging the idea of kind of authorship, and particularly that's relevant when thinking about making artworks, because we do actually learn from each other, and that's important to remember. But I was thinking in terms of when these things become, I mean, I was thinking particularly at the moment in the age of kind of like Facebook, and in a situation where we're meant to be constantly friendly to one another and constantly kind of making friends and not kind of risking potential people who may help us on down the line through our rocky roads through our art careers. And this kind of like effective labour that we have to do that is kind of used in some way, if we think about things like Facebook and Twitter and the way those things operate, where there is a kind of, all the way a place like Google might operate, where they have fun things for their workers to do, so they hang out getting their coffee and chat with each other, and that's meant to be good for productivity. And there's this, anyway, I guess the thing that I'm thinking about is the way soft power works, and also the way the notion of a collective has a political root. To me, has a political root, and the way words like that are kind of co-opted by large corporations, and this just becomes a matter of branding rather than. I'm not saying this can become, at the moment, it's quite a fashionable thing, I think, possibly, to be it could be a fashionable thing to be a part of a collective. I'm not saying that about the speakers, but I was just kind of, that's why I was kind of asking what your position was for calling yourself a collective before any other kind of group.
I think there's, in our case at least, I can speak about very briefly the experience when we came together. What was interesting is that in the context in which we first did, let's say in which we did our first exhibition, effectively we were not a collective, but a pavilion. And within the context of the Biennale, somehow as a pavilion, we took on ourselves the idea of, let's say, making evident a specific cultural phenomenon which was having a certain impact in the way in which we live, and we, let's say, even conceive of cities. And we thought that that phenomenon should have had equal voice as those, for example, of the nation state. On the other hand, though, I think it's perfectly fine, and we have to also admit that particularly nowadays, where almost every aspect of our life has become in some way entrepreneurial, being a collective is also a way of, if you want, sharing stakes, welfare and responsibilities to a certain extent, and is correlated to many, let's say, aspects of what creative life is nowadays. And let's say leading, if you want, a life, let's say, intricated with the creative industries.
I would say that at the same time opportunistic as it is idealistic, because at the same time I completely agree with the fact that being in a collective radically and truly challenges the authorship and the role of ideas in creative labor and sharing these things. But at the same time it is very opportunistic, and I mean, you could say that it's fashionable, but at the same time I think, as always, I think it's good to look at fashion and like why things are in fashion, because I think it's fashionable being a collective because it's a mode of work that actually relieves individuals from a lot of pressures and a lot of, let's say, limits. And in that way, I find it a very, let's say, positive way of working, even though you're right in saying that, yes, it's been also co-opted by corporate entities as a form of work.
I also, what you were saying regarding the situation of a pavilion, it's also that it's kind of like, ways of working together have also like this kind of different potentials or impacts depending on like certain conditions also. Like, also at some point with Castillo, there was also this idea that, the name can sound like the name of a commercial gallery, and creating this kind of like fake also front name was also like a way to kind of play with the situation we were at the beginning. Then it evolved, and like this kind of like feeling was not necessary anymore, and like that would be one point. The other would be that as far as collective can be fashionable, I wouldn't say it's always a very opportunistic strategy. I think working in a collective with Castillo brought, as I was saying, the possibility of doing lots of things that wouldn't have been possible individually, but I think it probably made me poorer at the same time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. There is no doubt. I meant opportunistic in the sense that like
Agency.
In terms of agency, in terms of like
Whoever has worked with an artist fee knows very well that splitting it in four does not really create big benefits for any of the individuals in the collective.
Yeah, no, I meant opportunistic just in terms of agency, in
Yeah.
terms of the fact that like working in four, also having other jobs or things, and splitting even like labor-wise,
Yeah.
opportunistic in that sense.
It's like having a large family, I
Yeah,
guess.
exactly.
We have another question here, thank you.
I'm very interested about the research that you have about this phenomenon of subletting properties that are being taking more form with the internet platforms, and it seems that it's something like new that is happening and changing the way the city is being organized. And if I was wondering if in your research have you been exploring like the idea of subletting of, like, I could say the majority of the cities of the world that sometimes are called third world countries or even fourth world, where the idea of the private property or having a property, it's completely different, where sublettal, rather than be a phenomenon or something new, it's the rule and it's the way how most of the cities are being organized.
Well,
In our case, let's say the whole idea of subletting, if you want, and I guess in relation to what you're saying, or to the comments you made on property, for instance, let's say stems from a very specific, let's say, economical model, which is, you know, the model on the rise of the collaborative economies that we all know through, that works under the doxa of access is more powerful than ownership. And so to a certain extent, we are very strictly, let's say, or with our work and our research, we, let's say, mostly in our previous work have addressed quite specifically that model. So the idea of the sublet, let's say, is ingrained within that discourse, which let's say has a very, if you want, contradictory dialectic between, if you want, the what we are seeing as the how do you say, the disappearance of the idea of property, as both a consequence of effectively not being able to own anymore, but at the same time, let's say, has a similar phenomenon in much, let's say, higher social ranks, where it is desirable, in fact, to not own anymore and to live a life of services. So in the same way, for example, the car lease probably is the earliest manifestation of this. So we have never effectively, I think I can speak on behalf of all of us in saying that we have never been interested, if you want, in replicating the dynamics of third world countries. It's not part of our ethos nor practice.
yeah, but I think maybe your question was also relating to the fact that these kind of platforms are also changing the landscape of property and ownership, also in different economic scenarios, in which, of course, if let's say places that were completely removed from certain dynamics suddenly have access. I mean, I see it a lot in, like, you know, I come from the south of Italy, and I see that, like, a lot of people especially in times of like economic struggle, because of course things like Airbnb started during the financial crisis in 2008, from 2008 or around there, and the sudden access to this kind of global platform has really radically changed the way people understand their, especially in a country like Italy, for example, which is based on like real estate and like people owning property, but it has changed the way it's used and the way it generates a revenue. So I don't know. I don't know if we want to your question.
No, but
whatsoever.
I think what I was trying to say is that I don't know if we can compare, let's say, the collaborative economies which are born on internet platforms to, let's say, the social infrastructures of solidarity within third world countries. I think we're talking about two different phenomenons.
Yeah, but in third world countries, internet is a fundamental part of this community collaboration. It's not, it is different platforms, different visibility, but internet definitely it's the main tool to create this collaborative.
But you see, this is, I think, interesting, because we are talking now about the internet as something which, let's say, has equal, or let's say we're addressing the web as the internet, and we are making a very, let's say, categorical discussion on it, let's say, expecting that, we can refer to the web in the same way we refer to it in third world countries as we refer to it here. In fact, it's a very, as you are pointing out, there is a very different way of using the web within these countries, with very different platforms and with very different, let's say, objectives even, which point out to the fact that the internet is in fact not this, let's say, this globalized entity with a unitarian voice, but is in fact, let's say, a much more mottled background of correlations between people, objects, properties, and values, which has many different...
Are you actually saying that we're not fully globalized? Which is a very exciting idea, the idea that there's still
first of all,
huge cultural difference.
First of all, absolutely, yes. We're not
well, that's so exciting to hear.
Absolutely, yes, we're not fully globalized, which is the reason why Mark Zuckerberg is going around with an airplane projecting internet beams on the yet uncolonized parts of the globe. But also, I think we have a very different relationship to access points to this global infrastructure, which in itself has a whole, let's say, economy of property, of passage, and of entry points and exit points.
But also I wanted to say maybe more simply, I think that the so-called sharing economy, in a way, it's the type of economy that flourishes online, especially because it really, let's say, monetizes those kind of relations that you're pointing at. So the kind of, if the internet, let's say, I mean, we were talking with that anthropologist that, what was his name? I forgot. Daniel Miller, who said that like the sharing economy, like many internet-based phenomenon, have always a duplicitous nature, so in which, like, if on one side the internet enables things like communities to be formed and in a positive kind of without any financial transaction, at the same time the very same technology and the very same relations can happen in a totally capitalist and for-profit, let's say, in a scenario that is completely the opposite.
Yeah.
So like couch surfing on Airbnb.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or, for example, the recent interest in the financial world of Bitcoin mining and the whole idea of cryptocurrency, for instance, within banking systems now.
Is that do you have more have you got another further question for us? We got one up here.
But you talk about subletting and various aspects of sharing properties and wealth and the internet. But take, for example, Airbnb. Take, for example, Airbnb. Take, for example, Airbnb or sharing your property. I mean, there are many legal aspects, certainly in this country, about insurance, liability, that sort of thing. And I mean, it's called Airbnb, but actually, if you operate a B&B in Wandsworth, or where we are now, I think, you need to be registered. So, I mean, how do you tackle the legal aspect and insurance aspect of property sharing?
I mean,
Or you just ignore it.
To ask a representative of
And I mean, the thing is, everything's all right until it isn't all right. And if something happens, say if how are you covered, insured and legally? How do you deal with houses of multiple occupation?
Perhaps to link the two questions, the previous one and this one, the practice, at least our practice, is very much embedded in our experience of these phenomena. And I don't think we're trying to, I wouldn't feel comfortable, for example, to talk about third world country on internet personally, even if it's probably very interesting. But it's really about tackling the affective relation, how, like, basically accessing, subletting your house or moving,
Yeah, but I'm not talking about
things.
I think your
But I'm
questions.
saying that I wouldn't be able to answer
I'm
the
asking you,
legality,
how do
basically.
you deal with the legal aspect?
Yes,
I think
there's
I think there's a misunderstanding. I think you might think that we are representing the company, but we're not.
I think it's a very interesting question, but I think it's outside the scope of this panel
Well,
to answer it really.
but we can move
in
into
a
the scope of this
It
panel.
should be within your scope because
we
you're
can
proposing
move
these
it. We
things.
can move it to the scope of the panel.
Anyway.
So, if
Well,
we
if
can
you
move
want to ignore the question, carry on
can
and
answer
it, but let's
and speak to somebody else.
No, we can move it to back to the discussion of the panel, which I guess is suited within an art school and therefore should address, let's say, perhaps the implications of this within an artistic practice. So we can talk, for example, about the legal implications, or we cannot talk about the legal implications, or the let's say the idiosyncrasy of sharing, for example, maybe not property, but for example, copyright or brand value. And intellectual property, and how that occurs, for instance, in the relationship between an artistic collective and a large enterprise, such as the one you have been describing until now. And that's as far as I can go, I guess.
We had to recently change our name because we got a cease and desist letter, which basically doesn't allow us to call ourselves by our original name. And it's just interesting to point out that these companies that basically disrupt, I mean, in general, these companies disrupt, let's say, laws and like insurance, let's say all of these problems that are actually regulated by the state, disrupted on a daily basis. Yeah, but they
Absolutely,
disrupt
yes.
them. But these companies disrupt them.
I think on that cheery note, we must stop now. We can the
Yes.
conversation can carry on. Barval will continue, and in a less kind of formal format, we can continue to discuss this at the front. But I'd like to thank all our guests very much for speaking, and Sarah very much for the moderation.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Thank you.